Okay, so I think the first place to start when we talk about kids are the opportunities that we have. Normally, certainly when it comes to Judaism, and we'll talk about general parenting as well soon, we're often used to outsourcing elements of our Jewish practice, whether it's in schools, it's in shuls. Often the verve, the energy, the excitement, our enjoyment of Judaism comes from external factors, even ones that we've signed up to. This is an opportunity to keep it back or bring it back to the home. That the home should be the center of Judaism, and that means from you to the children that it should emanate, and the zeal and zest and enthusiasm should come from the home. And please God, in a few months' time, then it will express itself again in shul, in school, in communities, but it starts in the home. Now, the question we often get in terms of parenting is, how on earth do I keep my kids, occupied, engaged? How do I get them to still like me during this period? I know summer holidays is often hard enough. You get on the plane and automatically it's, are we there yet? I'm bored. I want an iPod. I want a movie. I want a whatever. How can you possibly entertain your kids for whether it's a few weeks, it's a month, whatever it is? And I can't imagine the answer lies in binge watching, in constantly putting them in front of the iPad with all the various research that's gone into things which aren't so positive on there. Certainly when the isolation ends, you're not going to want them probably watching hours on end. The question is, how do we deal with that? What can we do? What advice can we give from one parent to another to try and, I guess, navigate and make the most of this opportunity? So I want to tell you a bit of a story. I'm not sure if your kids will appreciate the story. My kids certainly would not appreciate the story, but it's a story from one of my favorite parenting books, and it goes as follows. This is a quote, actually. He says, "My oldest brother is a very well-to-do and good-hearted. He helps many people happily and generously. But with his children, he acts differently. So differently that I used to find it very irritating. I almost never saw him respond to their requests enthusiastically. Or any time they'd ask for something, even something small, he would need to think about it." I've met parents like that as well, actually. "Even when he's obviously going to grant the request, he responds slowly, with a certain irritating formality. He keeps quiet for a moment, gazes at the child with a thoughtful and serious look, and then finally agrees." You can just imagine it. "Mummy, I'm really hungry. Can I have a healthy rice cake?" It's every parent's dream, right? And the father thinks, I need to think about that one. That's the kind of parent we're talking about. "I always thought that it was important for parents to show their children that they're happy to give and they will want to see them enjoy. Despite my critical thoughts," says his brother, "I never said anything to him, not even a hint. In general, I'm a non-confrontational type." Good luck to those. I like that. "And I'm especially so with my brother, who's something of a father figure to me. Once we took our kids on a trip together. This trip brought out our differences clearly. I responded happily to my children's requests, whether it was ice creams or the like, and I came up with my own ideas and offers to make the trip more exciting. But my brother continued to do his thing. He didn't offer anything extra. He responded to his children's requests in that annoyingly slow fashion, and he even dared to refuse them some of the things that I gave my kids. That really got me upset. The sight of my kids or his kids not having the same as mine felt very wrong. Towards the end of the trip, as we were loading up in the parking lot, we decided to bring the matter to his attention in a roundabout way. I called out loudly to my children." Now, by the way, we're not giving direct advice as to how to confront different parenting methods. Certainly, I've got siblings, as do you, who parent differently to me. But this is an interesting thing in terms of children's perspectives. And he says like this: "I called out loudly to my children, 'So kids, was that a fun trip?' I expected enthusiastic cheers, smiles from ear to ear, the works. But I was let down. 'Yeah, it was okay,' one of the kids said drastically or distractedly. 'How about you?' I said, turning to the other kid. 'Not bad,' he said indifferently. By the way, if they're teenagers, 'not bad' is a full sentence. That's sometimes very impressive. Their older sister summed it up. 'Not who knows what, but it was all right. It was okay.' This itself was very frustrating and disappointing, as you can imagine. I imagine there are many of us listening who've taken their family on a super holiday, spent lots of money, and at the end, 'How was it, kids?' 'Yeah, it was all right.' It was kind of like last year's holiday. That itself was frustrating and disappointing. What added insult to injury were the surprised looks on the faces of their cousins. I turned to them and I said, 'Did you kids have a good time?' Their beaming faces and enthusiastic responses was everything I'd hoped to hear from my kids. All throughout this experiment, my brother stood leaning against a nearby tree, watching with slightly amused looks. I glanced at him in confusion. He came over and whispered to me, "Watch this. Just cooperate with me. Second everything I say, and I'll explain afterwards." And here's where the story reaches its close in the theme. I nodded, and he said loudly, "I think you kids are right. These trips are just pathetic." Yeah, I agreed. Everyone's all excited at the beginning, but then no one enjoys it. My brother then said, "I just don't think it's worth doing these things anymore. Why bother? We can stay at home and we can get just the same results." What can I tell you, says this brother. It was like watching a magician at work. In an instant, the whole atmosphere changed. My kids protested loudly and began explaining and convincing him why it was such a good idea and how much fun it was. Then he began reviewing all the different details and stages of the trip, explaining how great each one was, while he stood there, arguing, shaking his head skeptically, and giving them a hard time. What was especially amazing was that as they were arguing with him, I saw they were convincing themselves about how great the trip was, not just us. A couple of days later, remember my brother is the pensive type, he says, my brother explained his approach to me. He says, when you show your kids how hard you're working to make sure they're having fun, you're showing them that it's your problem to make sure they're happy. That's how they perceive it. So they're never going to be grateful because they know if they're grateful, if they say this was fantastic, then it's job done. If your job is to make your kids have fun and be happy, then they can't possibly admit it was fantastic. Otherwise, there's a slight fear or concern that you're going to stop. But when it comes to me, he says, I don't rush to give them something, and I reassert the position that it's not my job to entertain you. I'm a father, I'm a loving father, but ultimately it's not my job to entertain you, even though I'm going to coach you through life and make you as happy as possible. And he ends off by saying, and here I thought I was going to teach him a thing or two. I think one of the important parenting lessons, certainly in isolation, is of course we provide a safe haven at home for our kids. And of course, during the summer holidays, we have to keep them active and stimulated. But I think it's an important message. If children, and obviously it's age dependent, if children can understand that they can also create activities, they can also try and learn some of their schoolwork, dare I say. They can also help with their brothers and sisters. It's not up to you completely to make the schedule. It's not up to you completely to entertain them. It's up to them to devise creative and clever ways for entertaining themselves. That will give them the wherewithal to create real and genuine independence. I think that's an important message. The more they rely on us, of course it's age dependent, but the more they do rely on us, then often the more upset and despondent they become as we constantly seek new ways of entertaining them. And ultimately that ends sometimes with outsourcing that issue and not making them happy at all. That is all lesson number one. Again, I dare say this to the children, but it's not always a parent's role to fully entertain the children. Lesson number two. I remember when we lived in Israel, it was one of the really difficult periods where there were sirens. There were rockets fired from the Gaza Strip. They were fired towards Jerusalem. That's where we lived. I remember running down the stairs through the stairwell. It was midnight into 1 a.m., 2 a.m. because of the sirens. And I remember the panic and the hysteria. Thank God, generally speaking, we do lead decent lives. Thank God, England in general, and it's not a political statement, is quite a boring country. Nothing much, dare I say, maybe before Brexit, actually happens. Of course, there's talk, there's politics, and life changes in minute ways. But in general, it's quite a stable place. It is quite a stable country. Our children don't often see us in a panic about real and genuine things. Our children don't see us often go through crisis, certainly not national crisis. This is your opportunity to teach your kids what it means to have stamina. This is your opportunity. Teach your kids. What does it mean to cope with challenges? This will pass, please God. The virus will end. But in decades' time, your kids might tell their kids, I remember how my parents dealt with this situation. I remember how my parents, didn't panic. I remember when they helped their neighbors. I don't remember much from my family holidays when I was young, although ironically I actually met my wife on a holiday, not because I know so, because I saw a picture of us next to each other in a swimming pool as she brandished it to me. But nevertheless, one thing I do remember is that when we were younger, we used to go to Netanya every summer because we're English. And one of the things we used to do is go to the square. The square had all these various different entertainment things and fun fairs. There's this panda, seems to have been there for years. I think probably the only panda not to be extinct because it's a bouncy castle, not a real panda. I jumped on there as a kid. My kids jumped on there as a kid. Dare I say their great-grandchildren will still be on that panda. And when the temple is rebuilt, no doubt it will be outside the temple for kids to jump on. But nevertheless, yeah, I remember at one point we were on this fun fair. It was actually one of these carousel type things. And standing there were a group of Ethiopian immigrants. They were poor. They were just watching the kids, often the tourists, go around. And my dad went up to the guy behind the counter and he bought a ticket for these two Ethiopian kids. He said, give them this ticket. They can have a ride. You should know, I don't remember anything from that holiday apart from that moment. When in times of crisis or in times where things are real and serious, that's when our kids realize exactly who we are and exactly what we believe. And therefore, this is an opportunity to give them what we would call in Jewish speak, some hashkafa. Give them philosophy. Tell them about challenges. Tell them about what you're doing to cope with challenges. It's fine that you can say you're worried, assuming that your kids can handle that. Obviously, if they've got anxiety in general, then it might not be the wisest thing to do. But that's okay. This, in many senses, is an opportunity. And just to give you one last thing, one last perhaps tactic, which I think is really important to get over to your kids, is unfortunately we sometimes live in an age which can be a little bit insensitive, where we think about ourselves. I remember you have some children who, when crisis hits, and I've had some children say this to me, not necessarily my own, they think about, will we have our special steak that we normally have on Passover? Will we have our special desserts? And sometimes there's a little bit of breadth lacking. Sometimes you have to focus in on the pain of someone else. And to get that message to your kids is also crucial. Let them feel the pain of others, not in a debilitating way, but in a real way. And just to finish on this note, my mum, I remember, one of the most powerful things in parenting she did for me, and I don't think she did this purposefully, but I don't know if anyone listening remembers that there were a group of Israeli soldiers, a couple of them, who accidentally drove into Jenin many years ago, and I remember those pictures of them being lynched and the bloody hands on the news, and of course on the newspapers, that picture. I remember my mum sitting there in front of the TV. In fact, she called us all to watch it, and I remember her face. She was absolutely distraught. And to see us as parents feeling other people's pain is something that our kids see, and it's something that needs to be developed. It's something that they require for their identity as Jews and as basic human beings. I think it's something we don't need to shy away from. Yes, we try and end with positive messages. Yes, we talk about doing things and taking action, but when situations are serious, we can also focus on other people's pains. And by the way, it can be macro. Have a conversation. What do you think it feels like for a birthday party to be cancelled? What do you think it feels like for a bat mitzvah to be rescheduled? What do you think it feels like for, instead of, if you're allowed to have a wedding now, instead of having 200 people, you have 10 people? What do you think that feels like? What would you react to that? And therefore, if we can just summarize the parenting segment, I think there are 3 or 4 things that do need to be reassured, things that we can speak to our kids about, again, age dependent. One of them is that it's not always our job to entertain. You create the syllabus, kids. You see if there are any fun activities we can do. And obviously, we're here to help and guide. Number 2 is this is the opportunity to give them perspective, give them some hashkafa, give them what does it mean to be in a time of crisis? What can we do? How can we help? What should we feel? And finally, other people's pain. Just to end on the online note, whilst there are massively important and great things online, again, the online binging is up to each individual. Personally, I would advise against it as much as possible. Books are great. Other things are great. Talking to your kids is great. Being together as a family is great as we try to build that Jewish unit, which has a centerpiece of harmony and that Jewish element, that Jewish facet of value and identity that starts at home and expresses itself more widely in community.